The evening sky was painted in hues of deep indigo and burnt orange as the last traces of sunlight faded behind the rolling hills of North Carolina. Neon signs flickered lazily outside Elliot's taproom, their dim glow reflecting off the wet pavement from an earlier drizzle. The soft hum of passing cars on Highway 74 blended with the occasional chirp of crickets, creating a strange harmony between the restless road and the stillness of the night. Terrence pulled into the gravel parking lot, his dusty old pickup truck rolling to a slow stop in front of the bar. The engine sputtered for a moment before dying down, leaving only the distant echo of country music bleeding from the bar's cracked windows. He sat there for a moment, fingers tapping idly against the steering wheel, his mind drifting as he took in the familiar yet foreign scene before him. It had been a long time since he'd been back home. Too long. Elliot's wasn't the kind of place that made headlines or welcomed tourists with flashy signs and overpriced drinks. It was a modest watering hole, a haven for the locals, truckers stopping for a cold beer before another long stretch on the road, old-timers swapping stories over whiskey, and the occasional wanderer looking for a place to disappear for a while. It was the kind of place where names weren't always exchanged, but nods of acknowledgement meant something. A quiet, unspoken camaraderie existed here, built on shared weariness rather than words. Terrence didn't come here to make friends, though. He didn't need conversation or company. He just needed a moment to breathe. The last week had been a blur. Returning home after deployment was always like that, a strange mix of relief and unease. The world had moved on without him, yet here he was, expected to slip back into it, as if nothing had changed. His body was home, but his mind was still half a world away, caught between the dust and echoes of distant battlefields. Tonight, he just wanted to sit in a quiet corner, sip a drink, and let the weight of the past months roll off his shoulders. Pushing open the creaky door, he stepped inside. The familiar scent of stale beer and aged wood greeted him, mingling with the faint aroma of fried food from the kitchen. A jukebox in the corner played an old Johnny Cash song, its melody weaving through the low murmur of voices and the occasional clatter of pool balls colliding. His eyes swept the room, instinctively scanning his surroundings. A couple of regulars were hunched over the worn-out pool table, their laughter rising above the background noise. A group at the bar exchanged stories, their words slurred slightly from too many rounds. Scattered throughout the room were a few loners, men nursing their drinks in silence, their gazes fixed on nothing in particular. Terrence found a spot near the back, a small table tucked away from the main crowd, but with a clear view of the room. Old habits died hard. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he'd learned long ago that trouble often found you when you least expected it. His camouflage uniform, though slightly faded, blended into the dim lighting of the bar, the only thing standing out being the worn sneakers on his feet, shoes chosen for comfort rather than appearance. When the waitress came by, he ordered a glass of water, ignoring the raised eyebrow she gave him. He wasn't here to drink. Not tonight. As he nursed the glass in his hand, his mind drifted, his thoughts filled with the faces he'd been waiting so long to see. His mother, always fussing over him the second he walked through the door. The smell of home-cooked meals filling the air, warm and familiar. His niece, probably counting down the days until his return, her laughter ringing in his ears even now. He smiled to himself, letting the warmth of those thoughts settle in his chest. For the first time in a long time, the tension in his shoulders eased just a little, but peace never lasted long. The door to the bar swung open with a loud bang, snapping Terrence from his thoughts. A group of 6 men strode in, their heavy boots echoing against the wooden floor. They were older, their leather jackets adorned with patches and insignias that told the world who they were. Veterans like him, but there was something different about them. Something sharp in the way they carried themselves, in the way their laughter, loud and boisterous, seemed to demand attention rather than invite it. Terrence barely spared them a glance. He had no interest in whatever storm they carried with them. But as he turned back to his drink, something in the air shifted. One of them had noticed him. A burly man with a salt and pepper beard froze mid-laugh, his sharp eyes locking onto Terrence like a predator spotting something out of place. He muttered something to his group, and one by one, they all turned to look. The laughter quieted. The air grew thick with something unspoken, something simmering beneath the surface. Terrence didn't acknowledge them. He'd been in enough situations to know when a man was trying to provoke a reaction. He kept his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, but his senses sharpened. The jukebox played on, but the night was about to take a turn he hadn't anticipated. The door swung open with a forceful bang, sending a gust of cool night air into the warm, dimly lit bar. The chatter inside didn't immediately die down, but the presence of the 6 men who strode in commanded attention. They moved with the kind of confidence that came from years of knowing they belonged, from having walked into countless bars, just like this one, and never having to think twice about it. They weren't just any group of men. Their leather jackets were worn but well kept, each one adorned with patches and insignias that told a story. To the untrained eye, they might have just been another gang of bikers, but to someone who knew what to look for, the truth was clear. These men had served, veterans just like him. The leader of the group was impossible to miss. Broad-shouldered and towering over the rest, he carried himself with the kind of presence that demanded attention. His beard, a mix of salt and pepper, was neatly trimmed, but it did little to soften the harshness of his face. His eyes were sharp, too sharp. They cut through the room like a blade, assessing, searching, and then they landed on Terrence. He had barely taken a sip from his glass when he felt the weight of the man's stare settle on him. It wasn't the usual glance a man gives a stranger in passing. It was different, longer, heavier. Intentional. Something shifted in the air. The leader, Hank, though Terrence wouldn't learn his name until later, had been mid-laugh, the kind of boisterous, self-assured laughter that filled a room and dared anyone to question it. But as soon as his gaze locked onto Terrence, the sound cut off like a switch had been flipped. His expression hardened, and without looking away, he muttered something low to the others. Whatever he said, it was enough. One by one, the rest of the group turned their attention to where Terrence sat, their expressions shifting from amusement to something else entirely. Their eyes swept over him, taking in the uniform, the relaxed posture, the sneakers, assessing, dissecting. The laughter that had followed them in, gone, replaced by silence. Terrence didn't need to hear what they were saying to know the kind of thoughts running through their heads. He had seen those looks before, felt them, the way they measured him, weighed his presence in the room against their own, and found him out of place. Unwelcome. It wasn't just curiosity. No, curiosity had a different energy to it. This was something else, something colder, something that crawled under the skin and settled there like an itch you couldn't quite scratch. He kept his focus on his drink, choosing not to acknowledge them. He wasn't here for trouble. He wasn't here for them. But that didn't matter, because trouble had already found him. At the bar, Hank leaned in, whispering something to one of his men, his lips curling slightly at the corners in a way that wasn't quite a smile. It was something closer to satisfaction, like a man who had just stumbled upon an opportunity he wasn't expecting but was all too eager to take. The others chuckled under their breath, their eyes never leaving Terrence. A challenge had been issued. It wasn't spoken out loud, but it didn't have to be. Terrence exhaled slowly, letting his fingers trace the rim of his glass. The cool condensation slicked beneath his fingertips. He could feel the energy in the room shifting, the way the air seemed heavier now, thick with something unspoken. It always started like this. A glance, a whisper, a feeling, and then it would escalate. The jukebox played on, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The heavy boots echoed against the wooden floor as Hank made his way toward Terrence's table, his broad frame moving with a slow, deliberate confidence. The kind of confidence that came from knowing he had the numbers on his side, that he had the power in the room. The rest of the bar had fallen into an uneasy hush. The usual hum of conversation dimming as eyes flickered between the approaching group and the lone soldier sitting quietly in the corner. Hank stopped just a few feet away from the table, planting his hands on his hips as he looked down at Terrence. His lips curled into something that resembled a grin, but there was no warmth in it. Only amusement. Mockery. Nice uniform. he drawled, his voice rough, like gravel rolling over pavement. "Picked that up at a Halloween store." Behind him, his men erupted into laughter, loud and grating, filling the space like a thick, unwelcome fog. One of them slapped another on the back, repeating the joke under his breath as if it were the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Terrence didn't flinch. He didn't rise to the bait. He simply lifted his gaze, meeting Hank's eyes with a calm, steady expression before replying, his voice even and controlled. "It's mine. I earned it." The laughter died down slightly, but Hank wasn't done. He tilted his head, feigning curiosity, his eyes flicking down to Terrence's feet. "That's so," he mused, raising an eyebrow. "Funny, because I've met a lot of real soldiers, and I don't recall any of them showing up to a bar in sneakers." Another round of snickers from the man behind him. Terrence let out a slow breath through his nose, his fingers resting lightly on the table. He had no interest in entertaining these men, no desire to prove anything. He had been in situations far worse than this, in places where the wrong move meant more than just a bruised ego. This was nothing. "I don't need to dress a certain way to prove who I am," he said simply. But Hank wasn't ready to let it go. He glanced back at his crew, smirking as he gestured toward Terrence with an exaggerated shrug. "Maybe he's one of those guys," he said, loud enough for the entire bar to hear. "You know, the ones who put on a uniform to get free drinks. Stolen valor, right?" One of the others nodded, leaning in. "Yeah, bet he tells sob stories to strangers just to get a little sympathy." Another chimed in, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Hell, I bet he doesn't even know the first thing about basic training." The laughter came again, this time sharper, edged with something more pointed. This wasn't just teasing. This was an attack. They wanted a reaction. They wanted him to crack. Terrence could feel the eyes on him now, not just from the bikers, but from the rest of the bar. Some patrons looked away, pretending not to notice. Others watched with curiosity, waiting to see how this would play out. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had nothing to prove to these men. "I don't need free drinks," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I just came here to enjoy my evening." Hank's smirk twitched slightly at the edges, the lack of reaction clearly not what he had hoped for. His jaw tightened just a fraction, but he recovered quickly, leaning in closer. The sour scent of beer clung to his breath as he sneered, his voice dropping just enough that only Terrence, and those paying close attention, could hear. "You don't look like a soldier to me," he muttered. "Where's your boots? Your dog tags? Hell, you probably don't even know how to salute properly." Another one of the bikers snorted. Bet he couldn't even recite the first damn thing from boot camp. The words were meant to humiliate him, to strip him down in front of the room. They wanted him embarrassed, angry. They wanted to shake him. But Terrence didn't move, didn't blink. Instead, he set his glass down, his fingers resting lightly on the table's edge, and finally, he looked Hank in the eye. "I don't need to prove anything to you," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. And for the first time since this encounter began, Hank hesitated. Just for a second, but the moment passed quickly, and the smirk returned colder this time. "Meaner. You think you're some kind of hero, huh?" Hank sneered, straightening up to his full height, looming over the table. "Walking in here like you belong." His voice carried across the bar, and Terrence could feel the tension in the air tighten, pressing in around them like an invisible force. The bartender had paused mid-pour. The regulars had stopped their conversations, their eyes flicking between the two men. Hank leaned in just a little more. "I don't think you do." The words were quiet, final, and just like that, the line had been drawn. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker, heavier with the weight of what was about to happen. The quiet murmur of the other patrons had all but faded, leaving only the steady hum of the jukebox in the background. The tension was almost tangible, stretching thin like a wire about to snap. Terrence exhaled slowly, keeping his gaze locked onto Hank's, unshaken by the challenge in the older man's stare. He could feel the energy shifting, the moment before action. He'd been here before, in places far more dangerous than this bar. He knew what came next. His voice was calm, deliberate. There was no anger in it, no heat, only the weight of absolute certainty. "I served 3 tours overseas," he said evenly. "I don't need to prove that to you." The words cut through the air like a blade. For the first time, there was a flicker of hesitation in Hank's eyes, a brief crack in his confidence. But it was fleeting, because men like Hank, men who lived off intimidation, didn't back down. Not when there was an audience. Not when the weight of their own pride was on the line. The silence stretched a beat too long, and then, just as Terrence had expected, Hank made his move. With a guttural grunt, he lunged, one massive hand shooting forward, reaching for Terrence's collar, aiming to yank him up from his seat like he was nothing more than a misbehaving kid. It was a mistake. Before Hank's fingers could close around the fabric, Terrence moved. His reflexes, sharpened by years of training and experience, took over without hesitation. He didn't think, he simply acted. With a swift, precise motion, he twisted to the side, his body slipping effortlessly out of Hank's grasp. At the same time, his hand snapped up, catching Hank's wrist midair in an iron grip. There was a brief, startled pause, Hank's breath hitching as he realized he no longer controlled the situation. And then Terrence turned the tide. In one smooth motion, he twisted Hank's arm back, forcing it up between the man's shoulder blades with a controlled, practiced force. The movement was efficient, effortless, years of muscle memory guiding his body as if it had done this 1,000 times before. Hank let out a sharp, involuntary gasp as his chest slammed against the edge of the table, his free hand scrambling for balance. The sound of his weight colliding with the wood sent a dull thud echoing through the bar, snapping everyone's attention to the scene unfolding before them. The other bikers froze. For the first time that night, their overconfidence wavered, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Hank was supposed to be in control. He was supposed to humiliate the outsider, make him regret walking into the wrong bar. Instead, their leader was pinned, his face twisted in pain, his bravado crumbling under the firm, unyielding grip of the man they had been so quick to judge. Terrence didn't tighten his hold any further. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. Leaning in just slightly, his voice low enough that only Hank, and the men standing too stunned to intervene, could hear, Terrence spoke with the same calm composure he had carried throughout the entire encounter. "I warned you," he said quietly. "You should have listened." Hank tensed beneath his hold, his pride battling against the undeniable reality of his situation. He tried to struggle, to twist free, but Terrence's grip didn't waver. From across the room, someone let out a low whistle, a quiet acknowledgement of what had just unfolded before their eyes. The bartender, who had been watching with his hand hovering near the phone, slowly eased back, no longer feeling the immediate need to call for help. The rest of the bar was dead silent. Terrence held Hank in place for a moment longer, just long enough for the message to sink in. Then, with controlled precision, he released his grip, taking a single step back. Hank staggered forward, his face red, his breathing heavy. He straightened, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he might crack a tooth. His hand hovered near his wrist, rubbing at the spot where Terrence had held him. He was furious. But more than that, he was humiliated. Terrence didn't sit back down. He didn't have to. He simply stood there, waiting, watching, giving Hank the opportunity to make a decision. The smart choice? Walk away. The stupid one? Try again. For a long moment, Hank just stood there, fists clenched, chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. The weight of the room was on him now. His men, the other patrons, the bartender, all waiting to see what he would do. Finally, he let out a slow breath through his nose, nostrils flaring. He forced a smirk, but it was a weak, hollow thing. "Guess you think you're some kind of badass," he muttered, rolling his shoulders as if to shake off what had just happened. Terrence didn't respond. He didn't have to. The silence was louder than anything he could have said. Hank's pride was wounded, but his anger burned hotter. His face was red with humiliation, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. The bar was still deathly quiet, everyone watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, in an explosion of frustration, Hank shoved away from the table and turned toward his men. "Call the damn cops," he barked, his voice thick with rage. "This guy just assaulted me." He's a fake. He's not even a real soldier." One of the bikers, a wiry man with a nervous energy about him, fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking slightly as he pressed the numbers. He held the phone to his ear, his voice loud enough for everyone in the bar to hear. "Yeah, we've got a guy here impersonating a soldier," he said quickly. "And he just attacked my friend." Terrence stood still, his expression unreadable. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen men like Hank before, men who hated to lose, men who would rather twist the truth than admit they'd been beaten, especially in front of an audience. The bartender let out a quiet sigh, wiping down the counter with slow, deliberate strokes, but he said nothing. Outside, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night air, growing louder with each passing second. Red and blue lights flickered against the bar's windows, flashing like a warning. Then, the door swung open. 2 officers stepped inside, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. The first was a broad-shouldered man with a close-cropped haircut, his face impassive behind mirrored sunglasses. The second was a woman, her features sharp and observant, her posture commanding but calm. The male officer scanned the room before speaking, his voice steady and firm. "We got a call about an altercation," he said. "Someone want to tell us what's going on here?" Hank wasted no time. He jabbed a finger toward Terrence, his voice dripping with indignation. "That guy," he snarled. "He attacked me out of nowhere. He's pretending to be a soldier, trying to get sympathy, probably a free drink too. He's a fraud." The officers turned to Terrence. He hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to Hank's words. His posture remained relaxed, controlled. But his eyes were sharp, unwavering. The male officer's gaze lingered on him for a moment before he spoke. "Sir, is that true?" Terrence shook his head, his voice as calm as it had been from the beginning. "No, sir," he replied evenly. "This man and his friends confronted me because they didn't believe I was a real soldier. We tried to grab me. I defended myself. That's all." The female officer took a step forward, scanning the faces around the room. "Did anyone witness what happened?" she asked. The bartender set down his rag, letting out a breath before speaking. "I saw it," he said. "Hank went after him first. The soldier only reacted to protect himself. It wasn't an assault." A murmur rippled through the bar. A man sitting near the jukebox, one who had been watching quietly from the start, spoke up next. "Yeah, I saw it too," he added. "Hank's been on edge since he walked in. The guy didn't start anything." The female officer's eyes flicked back to Hank, who stiffened slightly. The weight of the room was turning against him, and he knew it. The male officer turned to Terrence. "Do you have any proof of service, sir?" Terrence nodded. With measured movements, he reached down, grabbing his duffel bag from the floor beside his chair. He placed it on the table, unzipped it, and pulled out a neatly folded uniform, the name and rank stitched into the fabric. Inside the bag, along with the uniform, was his military ID. "You're welcome to take a look," Terrence said simply. The officer took the ID, inspecting it carefully. The female officer examined the uniform, her gaze flickering over the patches, the insignias, the signs of authenticity that couldn't be faked. After a brief exchange of nods between them, the male officer turned back to Hank. "He's legit," the officer said. "No question about it." A stunned silence followed. The tension in Hank's jaw tightened as his face darkened. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but before he could get a word out, the female officer cut him off. "Enough," she said, her tone sharp, leaving no room for protest. "From what I've heard, you instigated this, and you're lucky he's not pressing charges against you for assault." Hank flinched, but he masked it quickly with a scowl. The male officer folded Terrence's ID and set it back down on the table. His voice was firm, but there was something else in it now: respect. "We appreciate your cooperation, soldier," he said. Terrence gave a small nod. "Thank you, officer." Hank stood there, seething, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had no more cards left to play, no more excuses. He'd lost. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, glancing between their leader and the officers, clearly waiting for some kind of cue on what to do next. Then, the female officer spoke again, this time addressing the entire group. "Here's how this is going to go," she said. "We're filing a report about this incident. If you want to pursue your claims, you're welcome to. But I should warn you, false accusations are a serious matter. Hank's nostrils flared, his lips pressing into a thin line. But he didn't argue. He knew he had no case. The officers stepped back, giving the bikers space. The message was clear. It was time to leave. Slowly, Hank turned away, his shoulders stiff. His men followed, their bravado drained from their movements. The weight of humiliation clung to them like a second skin as they shuffled toward the door. Before stepping outside, Hank cast one last glare in Terrence's direction. "You'll pay for this," he muttered under his breath. Terrence didn't react, didn't flinch. He simply held Hank's gaze for a long, steady moment, then turned back to his drink. The door swung shut behind the bikers, and the tension in the bar seemed to dissipate, the weight of the confrontation lifting as the quiet hum of conversation slowly returned. The bartender exhaled, shaking his head before going back to wiping down the counter. Terrence sat back, fingers curling around his glass once more. His drink was still untouched. Around him, the atmosphere of the bar shifted. The wary glances from earlier were gone, replaced with something else. Something quieter. Respect. The jukebox kept playing, filling the silence they left behind. The bar door swung shut behind Hank and his men, the wooden frame rattling slightly in their wake. For the first time that night, the space felt lighter, as if the weight of their presence had been pressing down on everyone in the room. The dull hum of conversation, once stifled by the tension, slowly crept back in. But it was different now. Quieter, more measured. Terrence remained seated, his fingers lightly tracing the condensation on his untouched drink. He could feel the shift in the room, the stolen glances, the way people now looked at him not with suspicion, but with something else, something closer to respect. The bartender gave him a knowing nod before turning back to his work. A few of the regulars who had stayed silent during the confrontation now murmured among themselves, exchanging looks as if silently acknowledging what had just happened. No one spoke to him directly, but they didn't have to. The silence that had once been heavy with judgment now carried something different. Terrence let out a slow breath. He had seen this before, people unsure of how to react, caught somewhere between admiration and discomfort. He wasn't here for their validation. He never had been. But for the first time that night, he allowed himself to relax just a little. The moment passed. The bar returned to its normal rhythm. But the night, he knew, would linger with him. Days later, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of Terrence's driveway. He was beneath the hood of his old pickup truck, a socket wrench in hand, the rhythmic sound of metal on metal filling the still afternoon air. It was a simple task, something to keep his hands busy, to keep his mind from wandering too far. The crunch of gravel under tires pulled his attention away. He straightened, wiping the grease from his hands onto an old rag before turning to see the motorcycle rolling to a stop just a few feet away. The rider cut the engine and dismounted, hesitating for a long moment before removing his helmet. It was one of them, Bill. Terrence recognized him immediately, the wiry man who had been standing just behind Hank at the bar. He hadn't said much that night, but he had laughed with the others, watched, done nothing. Now, he looked different. There was no bravado in his stance, no cocky smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. If anything, he looked uncertain, as if he wasn't quite sure why he was here or if he had the right to be. Bill shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his oversized leather jacket, clearing his throat before speaking. "Hey," he said. Terrence didn't respond right away. He just studied the man in front of him, waiting. Bill shifted on his feet, exhaling sharply before looking up. I wanted to come by and say I'm sorry. For the other night." The words hung in the air, tentative as if testing their own weight. Terrence wiped his hands once more before crossing his arms over his chest. "You were part of it," he said simply. Bill winced, nodding. "Yeah," he admitted. "I was." Silence stretched between them. The wind rustled the nearby trees, filling the space where words didn't. Bill let out a breath, looking down at his boots. "Look, I ain't gonna make excuses," he continued. "I should have said something. Should have stopped it. But I didn't. I just went along with it. He hesitated before meeting Terrence's gaze again. That's not who I want to be. There was no grand speech, no pleading for forgiveness. Just an honest admission, raw and stripped of pretense. Terrence studied him for a long moment, weighing his words. He had heard apologies before, some empty, some genuine. This one felt different, not because of what was said, but because of the fact that Bill had shown up at all. Why now? Terrence finally asked. Bill shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck. Because it's the right thing to do. And because, well, seeing how you handled yourself that night, it made me realize how wrong we were. He let out a hollow chuckle. I've been around a lot of tough guys. But you didn't have to throw a punch to show what kind of man you are. His expression grew more serious. I don't want to keep adding to the kind of hate Hank carries around. I don't want to be like that. Terrence nodded slowly, letting the words settle. Apologies didn't erase the past. They didn't undo the choices that had been made. But they meant something. They had to. He let out a quiet sigh. Saying sorry doesn't change what happened, he said. But it's a start. A flicker of relief crossed Bill's face. He nodded, accepting that for what it was. Thanks, man, he said. I mean it. Bill climbed back onto his bike, adjusting his gloves before starting the engine. He hesitated for just a moment, as if considering saying something else. But in the end, he simply gave a small nod before rolling away. Terrence watched him go, his expression unreadable. Some battles weren't fought on foreign soil. Some weren't waged with weapons or strategy. Some were fought in bars, in quiet driveways, in the hearts of men struggling to choose between who they had been and who they wanted to become. And sometimes, just sometimes, the right choice was made. He turned back to his truck, wiping his hands clean as the sun dipped lower into the horizon. There would always be another battle to fight, another choice to make. But tonight, at least, one had been won. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away. Take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.